Now this I referred to earlier also, the statement by Echecorría that salvation must be a real happening in history. There must be something happening here in this world, in history, if the human race is to be saved. If it's to be saved from violence, from nuclear disaster, and now from ecological catastrophe. So salvation, which means God entering into history to save the human race that are his sons and daughters, this must be realized. It must be made real in history. This was a very important point in Echecorría's theology. The church must not only proclaim salvation, but also help to bring this about. Proclamation itself is a realization, and historical proclamation is a historical realization. That is, when prophets like Romero and the four sisters who were killed in the same year as Romero, 1980, and Father Rutilio Grande before them, prophets like Martin Luther King and so forth, when they proclaim justice and peace, they proclaim the coming of the kingdom, they proclaim the hope that the kingdom can come, that it is the will of God that the kingdom of justice come and be real in this world. That in itself has repercussions in history. It can cause people, move people to struggle. And so it's the salvation in history that Echecorría was talking about, not sort of above history or just in the interior of each person, in the heart of each person. It requires change, social, political, economic change, so that the kingdom can become more of a reality. Well, you can see that with that kind of notion of salvation, Echecorría and the others were going to get in trouble. And so the university was threatened, the bombs were set off in the university, and then finally they were assassinated in this very brutal way. And this is a very interesting concept too that Echecorría had, that he expressed in his book, which is mentioned there, published by Marinol, the Orbis Books, the publisher, the Marinol publisher. The church, as the continuation of the principal sacrament which Jesus Christ is, must realize what it proclaims. That is, not only talk is cheap. And even St. Francis, centuries ago, said we must always evangelize, we must always proclaim and bring the good news of the kingdom, the good news of a better life, the good news of a decent future. We must always do that. And when necessary, when appropriate, with words. And so Echecorría's concept here, which is very current in the church, especially after Vatican II, the church is the continuation of the principal sacrament which Jesus Christ is. Now this is a somewhat different notion of sacrament. We think in the Catholic Church of the 7 sacraments, baptism, confirmation, First Communion, and so forth. But more fundamentally, the church is the sacrament of Jesus. That Jesus is the sacrament of the love of God, the incarnation of the love of God, the principal sign of the love of God. The church is a sign of Christ, a sacrament of the presence of Christ. So when the church invites people to community, to come out of their loneliness and their despair, and to form community, to help one another, and to work for a better world, it is making Jesus real. It is making the love of Jesus real in this moment and in this particular place. And so the church is the sacrament of Christ. And we, as members of the body of Christ, are ambassadors of the love of Christ. So after the funeral, I decided that my place was in the United States. I did not want to return to Nicaragua at that moment. I thought that as a Jesuit, as an American citizen, a US citizen, I had to go to the US to talk about this, to help to denounce this horrible act, and to denounce US support for that murderous regime in El Salvador that had just done this, And so my fellow Jesuits were totally in accord. So I went to Washington and started talking with some friends, Phil Berrigan and others in the peace community there. And then we threw some blood on the gateposts of the White House, the front gateposts on the sidewalk, the street, facing the street, not the pillars, not the white pillars of the White House. But because we felt that the blood of the Jesuits and the two women who had been killed, the blood of many martyrs of Latin America, was on the hands of the President of the United States, on the hands of the government of the United States. They had blood on their hands, and we wanted to make that visible. And so it was a dramatic act of trying to bring home this terrible act that had been done by forces dependent upon the United States. And so we did that, and it was an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. And we spent a night in jail and had to pay a small fine, I believe. But we continued our activities, and I think the killing of the Jesuits and the two women sparked a great increase of consciousness and awareness of what had been going on in El Salvador. So Phil and a couple of other people, as well as myself, were arrested there in front of the White House. A very small price to pay in comparison with what my fellow Jesuits had paid in El Salvador. I mentioned previously, and I'd like to return to this now and wrap this up fairly soon, but to look a little more carefully at what Dr. King said in his famous speech exactly 1 year to the day before he was assassinated. He gave this speech at the Riverside Church in New York City, and of course he was assassinated in Memphis exactly 1 year later. And this is what got Martin Luther King into trouble in ways that he had not been in trouble with certain sectors of the American population and government before. Because here he started to address the injustice that the United States government was committing abroad, not just in the South, not just in the suburbs of Chicago and so forth, the racism and so forth, but he felt it necessary to address the violence and the racism also that was involved in our foreign policy. And so this is what he said during that speech in 1967, that it seemed to this American official that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. There were revolutions happening, and there had been, but especially during the 60s, during the 60s with the revolution in Guatemala and other places, revolutionary movements in various parts of Latin America and other parts of the world. And so the United States was usually in a position of helping to suppress these revolutions. And he wanted to point that out. A pattern of suppression, which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. Here he talks about stability for our investments and refers to the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. He's referring to the participation by the United States government, the CIA especially, in a coup, a military coup in Guatemala in 1954, because the democratically elected government of President Arbenz in Guatemala had begun to nationalize some of the uncultivated land of the United Fruit Company. And this was considered just intolerable, just something that could not be permitted, any government of Latin America touching, affecting the interests of an American corporation. And so the CIA was involved, this is generally well known, involved in organizing and supporting that coup in 1954 in Guatemala to get rid of that government, even though it had been democratically elected, get rid of that government. And then the government and governments, the regimes that ensued, were all very repressive, extremely repressive governments. He refers to Cambodia and the Green Beret forces against the rebels in Peru. And then, of course, he addressed Vietnam, which was his main concern. And he referred to JFK, that those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable. So this, I think, invites us to take a look at U.S. foreign policy, take a look at world politics, world economic interests, U.S. economic interests for the stability, the stability of our investments. As Dr. King said, also we know that the United States corporations make use of the cheap labor throughout Latin America and other parts of the world. In Nicaragua, they can get factory labor for about $200 a month. And so we need to look at the economic interests, the corporate economic interest of the big corporations of the United States and of other countries, the economic interests which are at the heart or the foundation of foreign policy. That is, our government policy, our political policy usually serves our economic interests. So we can see that clearly in El Salvador and expressed clearly in the words of Dr. King in 1967. So he refers to that, to Kennedy's statement, and that we are making peaceful revolution impossible, and it all has to do with the immense profits of our overseas investments, of empire. We don't like to think of the United States as an empire, but most of the rest of the world does. Now, and again, we're getting close to the end here. Again, I refer to the Center for Justice and Accountability, their excellent work on this and their excellent summaries of the information. So in 1989, Congressman Joe Moakley got busy with a special task force, and they looked very seriously. He was very deeply concerned about this, and they looked very seriously and in detail at what had happened on November 16th of 1989. And they revealed that it was the upper echelon of the Salvadoran army that had given the order for the murder of the Jesuits. Something that most of us had already known, but it was interesting that the task force of the U.S. Congress came out with that finding. And he also pointed out that 19 of the 26 Salvadoran soldiers involved in the murders had been at the U.S. Army School of the Americas, now known as the Western Hemisphere Institute for Security Cooperation. And but they had been there. 19 of them had received training there, and all of them had received special training in El Salvador just a few weeks before they were sent to carry out this action. Special training by the U.S. Special Forces. And so then in 1992, the peace accords, which brought an end to the fighting, and as part of the settlement, they agreed to the establishment of a UN-appointed Truth Commission to investigate the abuses committed during the war. This was a very important development. And they discovered and reported that almost all of the human rights abuses had been committed by the Salvadoran armed forces and the paramilitaries. Some violations of human rights had been committed by the revolutionaries, the FMLN, but the vast majority had been committed by the government, and of course the government, the armed forces, with U.S. support, U.S. training, and so forth. So the details of this were spelled out. So on that night in November of '89, then Colonel Rene Emilio Ponce, he has died subsequently, with these other colonels present, ordered Colonel Benavides to kill Jesuit Father Ellacuría and to leave no witnesses. So that's the fundamental fact, that this horrible massacre was carried out with orders, due to orders from the very top of the Salvadoran command structure. And so that those were just some other aspects, that a few more details that I wanted to bring out. And I will conclude now, and I would encourage you to send me an email if you would like to have access to this slide package. And I think as we celebrate, as we say, celebrate the martyrdom on November 16th, and we think of all the other martyrs of Latin America, not just these 6 Jesuits and the 2 women killed with them. We need to ask always, what does this mean to me? How does this challenge me? What does it call me to do? How does it call me to live? How can I live out the love of Christ in our love for the poor, our love for victims of society, and especially in our in our work for a better world, our work for justice. So, thank you very much.